we have Dr. Mike Nelson on with us today. So, Doc, first of all, it's really cool that you're from Minnesota. When I found out you were from Minnesota, I
Yes.
got all excited. And then I got more excited when I realized you're an experienced heat ice training, human performance, HRV. I'm not sure that much about the lipid analysis and all those sort of things, so I'm excited to peel into
Yeah.
that. Did my homework and was like, this guy's the man. And then I started following your Instagram, and your morning workouts look epic, especially the music references. So,
Yes.
first and foremost, man, I really appreciate you putting aside some time to talk to us today, and joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you reaching out and stuff too. Yeah, the Instagram thing, I just started doing random story stuff because I'm always interested,
Yeah.
what do other people like do for training? Like, what does it look like? And so I just started doing it initially for my own just documentation of stuff. And then, yeah, it's kind of fun.
Well, so you seem really organic, but also highly intelligent behind why you're choosing to do certain things. And that was one of the things that I was really curious about when I started diving into your work. Is it just seemed really creative, right? And this is something where, for me, I got overexcited because I've been seeking for these sort of creative, intuitive ways of training.
Hmm.
And when I dove into your work, and then, like I said, Dr. Blesa, I was reading her book, saw your
Yeah.
name, and was stoked because we had already kind of been talking. So I was just looking into that. But when you kind of break it down, before we hear more so what you do specifically, what is the intuitive way of what makes you think the way you think, or what excites you about human performance at a personal spectrum, I suppose?
Yeah, for me, I think I live in the area of what is kind of the research versus the me search,
Mm,
right? Because working with clients, if they did something and I could say, there's 17 studies that support that, and they're like, oh, okay, that's cool. Or they did something, they got some cool effect, and I'd be like, well, I don't know, there's no research to support that, right? I
yeah,
do some stuff with like reflexive performance reset,
sure.
and they don't really care, right?
Right, right.
They come to you like they would come to you. They pay for a result.
Hmm.
Then they trust that you've done your homework and you have experience and that you can get them the result. If you go into research, right, and you're obviously trying to publish something, you need to know what's going on, what are the backgrounds, and that type of thing.
Hmm.
So to me, it's like kind of what is the gap between them? Can
Hmm.
I take research at a pretty high level, kind of understand it, talk to other researchers, and then what does that lead into for the next action?
Hmm.
And then if you iterate that forward, like what is kind of the sort of the bleeding edge of that, where there's some physiologic rationale, and then is there something I can test out to see what happens, at least at an N of one.
Yeah.
And if that works, then I'm a weirdo, so I'll spend, I have a friggin' metabolic cart, I've got a Moxie sensor, I've got stuff to try to measure that N of one at a little bit more of a physiologic level too, in addition to performance outcomes and that kind of stuff. So it kind of allows me to go, okay, if I think these theories about at a very high level at an
Yeah.
organism are true, what if I do this? Like, here's what I think is going to happen, but I can test that and what has actually happened.
Sure.
So for me, that makes it interesting, right? Because it
Yeah.
allows me the freedom, because it's just me, it's not a client,
Right.
nobody's paying me for it. If I screw up, I'm okay with that, right?
Yeah.
I'm very hesitant to do that with client stuff, so I'll test all sorts of nutball shit on myself
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. Well, so and take that deeper in the terms of, because we'll peel into yourself individually,
Yeah, yeah.
but for people to get an idea of what you're talking about, I mean, I know briefly that you are highly in the one-on-one human performance world, and obviously you travel and do sort of things. Can you sort of give a overlying theme of what you do outside of yourself, more so for the clientele or the field of human performance in general?
Yeah, so I think of myself more as a systems person.
Hmm.
So I did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, did a master's in mechanical engineering. So probably having more of an engineering background before I did a PhD in exercise physiology and metabolism. I think that gives me more of a systems approach.
Yeah.
So even when I was doing my PhD, I used to have several disagreements with my advisor about how some things were useful and other things were not useful. So I try to look at I'm kind of obsessed with what are the principles that the body runs
Mm-hmm.
on, and then can we try to disprove those principles. Because science is basically always trying to disprove something. It never really proves anything.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, the law of gravity, man, that's been around for a long time. No one's been able to disprove it yet. It's probably true, right? Everything else in between, not quite so sure.
Yeah.
Right. So I look at kind of a systems level approach. So for clients, like I'm one-on-one, I do everything from training, nutrition, lifestyle, sleep, heart rate variability, some basic blood work that's within health range, not their physician type stuff. Because what I found, the longer I've done stuff, the more I find everything is kind of all related to each other, and everybody kind of has their own rate limiting step. Right.
Yeah.
Some people it's nutrition, some people it's training, some people it's their lifestyle. And so I found that if I just include all of that, and I know not all clients are going to use all of that,
Right.
It was just easier, and then allowed me to view them as a whole system, as a human organism, not just everybody tends to get really specific into what their narrow field is.
Yeah.
And so if you spend your whole career looking at muscle synthesis, you're probably going to, be very dependent on looking only at protein and think fasting is the world's stupidest idea ever, right? Just because that's the lens of how you're viewing the world all the time.
Right.
So I try to, if I can, step above that and look and say, okay, here's what I think is true. Here at a systems level, I think is what you need. Can we set it up so we can measure that now to see did what we think, what the story, is it actually true? And we can use data to either support that or refute that. And for right or wrong, that's okay.
Yeah.
It allows us to kind of course correct and get to the end result, which is what their client's paying you for, which is their goal.
Yeah, I love that. So one of the things that you talked about in that concept, so if they come to you for a variety of options, which is really cool in general. Now, with things being right or wrong as you're experimenting, do you make that communication known to them that we're going to try this. If not, we're going to switch here and we'll just keep tracking. Do you sort of leave that open-ended curiosity for the client as well so they can kind of see things on their own perspective too?
Yes and no. I would say depends on the client. So most clients, the catch when you talk to someone initially is the number one thing that they want to know is, are you the person who can solve my problem? Right. So if I'm going to hire a plumber, to do something in my house, I actually had an electrician rewire a heater in the garage.
Okay.
My first question is, before even how much does it cost, is, am I 100% sure you're the person who can do this task? And it was, for them, it was a very easy task.
Sure.
But there's the same thing if you're a trainer, right?
Yeah.
The person on the other end is wondering, can you actually solve this problem I have? Because I've had it for 17 years. I haven't been able to figure it out. Maybe I've hired a few other people. They haven't been able to figure it out.
Yeah.
And with that, I spent like a whole hour just asking them questions. Okay, what do you do for this? What do you do for that? And at the end of that, like one person I had recently, I'm like, I think that it's probably your aerobic base is very low. And that's leading to all these other reasons of why you can't reach your goal for fat loss, performance, that type of thing. Now, I said, that's what I think is going on. But what we're going to do is we're initially going to test it. We're going to run a VO2 max test. We'll use two different methods. If we find that you're in like the 70th percentile, then you're probably pretty good. We'll have to look to see what else is going on.
Sure.
If you're in like the 20th percentile, so you're near the bottom, I feel more confident that that's probably what's going to go on. So we're going to do the other things. We're going to do the training you like. But here's the deal. You're going to need to, probably do 30 minutes a day is some boring aerobic type training. And we know from science the adaptation to kind of start to see that inflection where it's starting to get better is about 6 to 8 weeks. Now, again, there's a huge variability within that.
Sure.
You're going to have to put in some time and effort. You may not necessarily feel better to almost like 2 months in to even know if what we think is going on is correct.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen this with a lot of people in the past. Historically, so far I've been pretty accurate, but I can't guarantee that that's going to be the thing. I feel pretty confident that it is.
Yeah.
And then do you want to run this experiment or not? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. And so far, 4 weeks into it, everything's been doing well and everything's been getting better. So,
yeah, that is powerful to think about because 2 months is is rather quickly, but it's rather a long time when someone's trying to make a jump of sustaining
Oh,
that thing,
sure.
especially if they're going into any sort of new realm, right? It's one of the things I've found with breathing is, doing any sort of breath adaptation or anyone with that, it's hard to see progress in certain things.
Yes.
So you have to keep them very in tune and believing and trusting and trusting and trusting and keeping them going around that concept. Now, something you said early that really stuck with me was about when you were getting your PhD. And I haven't experienced that realm of thought or people essentially diving into that. But I got to imagine the pot of people are very curious on their own end with like a system to learn from. But then you kind of jump off that platform to your own discoveries is sort of how I've always looked at that of developing your own research and those sort of things. Now to peel back into that, what is the route when you're around other people pursuing a PhD or even a professor in that world? And is that a tough world to navigate through to be unique? Or do people find themselves really involved with science and not getting into their own creations? Because like I said, something that seems really cool about you is you do use a lot of science and have a lot of these backgrounds, but then you also seem very intuitive and experimental. So I'm just kind of asking in the sense of, do you find people fall in love with science and not leave it? Or do you find people use bits and pieces of it and then also their own intuition?
I think it's both, and it's highly dependent on the person. Like I've definitely seen both types of people.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously because of my bias, I'm more drawn to people who do what I think is more creative experiments. But the hard part is if you live in academia, the big thing that you're in charge of or what you're rewarded for, how much money can you pull in via a grant, right? Because everyone needs money to run. And then it's usually publications. Like how many publications can you get in? You can get in a higher, more top tier journal that's going to be looked upon as more favorable.
Yeah.
So I think because of that, you're limited on what you can look at because of funding, right? So for example, if you
Wow.
talk to a lot of people that do sports performance research, that's not really where their funding comes from, right? So if you talk to like Stu Phillips, who does a lot of muscle protein synthetic research, really, really awesome stuff. He's a former athlete. He's very interested in athletics and performance, but a lot of the grants and the money he gets is for looking at what happens to muscle mass as people age, right? Because to the NIH, who supplies money, that's a bigger health issue than trying to get Bob to run a faster 100 meters,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So
Never
within
thought
those
about that.
confines,
Yeah.
you're always kind of walking this balancing act of, yeah, I need funding. I need my lab to run. I need to pay for some of these experiments because they're expensive. Can I do enough of that? And then can I kind of look at other athletes and other things, maybe with different money or from the same money, however you figure that out.
Right.
To me, that allows you a little bit more creativity of what questions you can ask then. And then the bias of just trying to get another publication, it's easier to ask more basic questions that are more iterative and not kind of jumping a gap. So, for example, I got farmed out to the epidemiologic department for a year and a half of my PhD. Long story short, we did this study looking at stuff on borderline type 2 diabetics and movement, analyzed all the data, got everything done, presented to my the PI, so the private investigator on that study. And I was like all excited because this is a year and a half of my life. I got all the data crunched, and I'm like, hey, basically this thing we thought that happens, it didn't happen. But I said, I got most of the publication already written. I'll be able to finish this in the next couple of months. And he's like, well, we can't publish that. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
He's like, well, that's not the result we thought. I'm like, yeah, I know it's not the result we thought. But he's like, no one will be interested in it. And I'm like, but what we got is what we got. Like, I don't, this is the hypothesis. It turns out we weren't right. We didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
But I think I was shocked to even at that level be like, well, we would just publish it. It's a null result. But if you look at a lot of what literature has been published, most of it is not really a null result.
Right.
Because it's just not as interesting. It's not as sexy.
Wow.
So I think there is a big bias
Yeah.
in that direction still, although it's gotten a lot better. And then the last part too, like in the lab that I was in, I was like the only person who gave any two craps about performance, like at all. My advisor didn't care at all. Was only
Yeah.
looking at cardiovascular stuff, just using exercise
Yeah.
to move stress around in the body. One of the person was there. She was looking at cardiac stuff related to cancer. So
Okay.
we'd have all these undergrads because we ran undergrad labs that
Yep.
come in and they'd be like, "Hey, what do you think about this supplement or about this type of performance training?" And the running joke in the lab was like, they'd all just point and go, "I don't know, you have to ask him." And I'm thinking, I'm like, but you're like a PhD in like
Yeah.
you're in exercise physiology. To the one lady I asked her, I said, "Aren't you interested in all in like what happens with like different nutrition and training methods?" She's like, "No." I'm like, really? This is so weird.
That is weird. That is weird.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I can't even, well, I get my question to you is what makes you curious about that topic? Because it sounds like you're obviously the outlier here.
Yeah, and it varies between
Right.
different labs, right?
Sure.
And now I think the internet has helped a lot, right?
Yeah.
So you can go to my buddy Dr. Bill Campbell's lab in Florida. He has a whole friggin' lab set up looking at physique enhancement and what happens with, high level athletes.
So
You can
he'd
talk to
be
Dr.
the
Eric
opposite
Helms.
of that, right? So he's
Yeah.
all in that. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but he's tenure. He's been doing it for quite a while.
Yeah.
Dr. Eric Helms is in University of Auckland's doing some cool stuff. So there's a lot more of that now than there ever was before. For me, I think a lot of it was just solving my own problems. I started college. I'm 6'3". I was 156 pounds like my first year of college.
Wow.
I'd already passed my growth spurt. I was like
Yeah.
a eel-shaped rake that would almost wash away in the drain. So I'm like, maybe I should do this weightlifting
Yeah, I should
thing. Maybe
try
I should
this
try to
out.
figure this out. And then, you start doing it and you do everything wrong, you injure yourself,
Yeah.
you don't make any progress. And at the same time, I was just interested in biology. I was like, wow, how does stuff work? It's amazing. Even now, it's amazing to me that, the first bench press I ever did in high school, I got crushed by like the bar, like the 45-pound bar, and I was like, oh, so they have women's bars that are lighter you have to use. Gosh, shit. But to me, it was fascinating that if you got crushed by a 45-pound bar, let's say your limit is just 45, right? The fact that you could use 35 pounds and just do more reps, and eventually you could do a 45-pound bar,
Yeah.
even though you had never done it before.
Right.
Like, to me, even now, this is still like fascinating.
Yeah.
I understand the concept of adaptation and everything,
Yeah.
but just the whole process of, how does all that stuff work? So when I was 4.5, I had an open heart surgery.
Oh, wow.
So I had what's called an ASD or atrial septal defect.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a thoracotomy. So they crack your chest open.
Yep.
They go in and they just stitch the wall between the atrium, between the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. So they were mixing back and forth. Right. So your heart gets super big because in essence you go into heart failure.
Sure.
So it's like almost like having a 3-chamber instead of a 4-chamber heart. So luckily they went in, they closed up the wall. I kind of grew into the size of my heart. Around the same time I had some eye issues.
Okay.
So even now I don't entirely see in 3D. So I had what was called a strabismus or a lazy eye. So my eyes didn't track together at all as a kid.
Okay.
So they would patch the one quote unquote good eye to make the bad eye work more. And then my eyes would track together.
Sure.
And they're like, oh, great, we solved your issue. Woohoo! But later, like in my 20s, I figured this out, is my right eye sits up and out farther. It has what's called the horizontal and vertical deviation. And my brain's workaround when I was a kid, I used to see in double vision.
Wow.
So when you see in double vision, you soon realize when you interact with your environment,
Yeah.
like what's the real image and what's the false image, right? Because it doesn't match. If I were to grab a cup, I can only grab the real image. So your brain kind of figures out what's a real and what's a false image.
Wow, that's crazy.
But it doesn't want to be confused. So you've got two eyes like this, and they form an image in the back of the brain that's offset just a tiny bit because of the eye position in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain then fuses those images into a 3D image. In my case, the images were so skewed, it saw two of them. It couldn't fuse them together. They were too disparate. So what it does, which in a way is kind of brilliant, it does what's called a visual suppression. It'll just cut out the image from one of your eyes. Because your brain goes, aha, I solved the issue. We only see one of everything now. Woohoo, everything's great.
Yeah, and it moves on. Okay, that makes sense.
But you drop from binocular vision to monocular.
Wow.
So in essence, you lose depth perception.
Wow.
I never understood, like in high school, like I hated any ball sports, just utterly atrocious.
Yeah, I
It
was
was
gonna ask you, did
a
you
top
play anything?
fly
Yeah,
to look up
yeah.
and have several seconds. That should be the easiest thing for someone to do. For me, it was the hardest because it took out every single workaround I had,
Wow.
and I would get hit with balls in the face.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Just plopping you on that forehead.
Yeah.
That
So I
is
think it was kind of a
wild.
combination of
Yeah,
all those things of being actually not athletic at all. It was like, oh, well, if I want to get better, like, how do I figure this out? So a lot
sure.
of it initially was just trying to figure stuff out of myself. And it still kind of is to some day.
Yeah, no, I love that concept, and that one thing I'm thinking about too. Now I'm even more curious to ask you about the ice because obviously
Yeah.
I originally came to the ice and the heat and breathing and movement. I played baseball for a few years. When I got out of baseball, I was just always attracted to what made people. What you just said, that's what I've always been curious about is how do people want to do certain things or what makes people want to do certain things, right? And did you get? Are we still on there? I got poor connection here, Nolan. Can you hear me, Mike? I
Yep,
got.
you're back.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, I don't know if we're getting snowed on like crazy, so I could have been dropping my connection there. But anyways,
Oh, that's all right.
what makes me curious is what makes people do what you just said, and how do people get excited about certain things and then sustain that, right? And when I came into the ice, I was in the sports psych. My master's degree was in sport performance with a part of sports psychology, and I was always curious to how do
Ah,
you
cool.
progress the mind, right? Like I understood mental training was important for athletes, but why didn't we want to do it, right? Why didn't we want to sustain it like we wanted to bench press, right? Everyone wanted to bench press, but why didn't we want to get into some subjective, higher awareness way of thinking? And so now when I go towards you with those sort of things and experimenting on yourself, have you noticed things with the way that you train of the heart or your vision or your breath? What is it always stayed like that? That's made you curious about yourself first, and you test everything out on yourself first, and then that's sort of what makes you so excited to learn?
I think it's a combination of it.
Mm-hmm.
Just marveling at just physiology in general.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is like a problem that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to figure out and probably will never figure out even the tiniest portion of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But you can get your hands around some of it, which I think is fascinating. Um, I would say it's also the combination, like what I've been able to figure out forces me to go relatively hard into different disciplines. So one
Yeah.
of the greatest things when I finished my PhD, I didn't finish till I was almost 40, was, oh my God, I finished my PhD. I can learn whatever the hell I want to learn
Yeah.
now, especially running my own business. And as long as I have the money and time to do it, like no one can tell me like, oh, that's just worthless. Like
Oh
I can
yeah.
go learn neurology. I can go do more hands-on work. I can go do whatever. It doesn't matter. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you're in a strict academia, you have to follow, the protocols, the classes, all that kind of stuff, which is useful,
Sure.
right? Because otherwise everybody just skips the basics. And so there is a use for it. And so then I was like, okay, well, how in my head, and Tom Myers said this once. He's like, if you start without having at least a moderate level intake of another discipline, you just start combining stuff together. He's like, you just get like dish soap, right?
Mm.
It's like a chef who doesn't know what he's doing and trying to make a really good soup and just throwing crap into a pot,
Sure.
right? It just turns out and it's not very good.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you can get to be a high level chef and this matches with this and this matches with that. So I said, okay, so if I'm going to look at other disciplines, at least for me personally, what is my cutoff? Like, what is the thing that I can say when I'm good enough in this area? Now I can kind of look at how this area affects something else,
Yeah.
right? So for me, one of the barriers was, will someone pay me for the service, right? Will
Sure.
they pay me only for that service?
Sure.
And will someone pay me to actually teach it?
Wow.
If they'll pay me for a service and they'll pay me to teach it, to me, I'm like, okay, I must have reached some level where now I can start to look at different things.
Yeah.
Right. So I started doing that with nutrition stuff. I've taught, different colleges for nutrition level stuff. I did some hands-on stuff off and on for years. And then I recently did some more stuff through Reflexive Performance Reset, Be Activated through Doug Heal's stuff about 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a whole bunch of paid sessions for that. I'm an instructor for RPR. I do some stuff through the Carrick Institute, looking at the neurology lens of kind of exercise, but still more in the exercise range and nutrition. And so that's been good to have those kind of constraints.
Yeah.
To say, okay, here I'm going to stay in this lane, so to speak, until I get to this level. Okay, now I can start looking at how all these things relate. Like, so your question, right?
Right.
So how does temperature relate to breath, relate to performance?
Yes.
Right? There's other things you can do now once you start mixing those things together.
Right.
And to me, the intersection, like if you ever read the book Range by David Epstein, is if you can, to get to an expert level, right? So like elite athletics, right?
Yeah.
To get to be the elite of the elite, most people are never going to get there. Probably doesn't even matter what they do for training.
Right.
But can you get to a very, very high level in two disciplines and then look at the intersection of those two disciplines? That's actually doable for almost everybody. Now, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a fair amount of work. But I agree with his thing that intersection of those two disciplines, that's where all the really cool stuff is.
Yeah.
Right? That's an almost very unexplored range, right? And especially now with, Wim Hof and breathing and cold.
Yeah.
Right? 10 years ago, if you said, yeah, I'm going to do some breathing and get really cold, they're like, what the hell is wrong with you?
For
like,
sure.
These things are not related at all. What are you're speaking mumbo jumbo.
Right.
And now we're like, oh, wow, look at this and how this is related. So I think part of it is what are those intersections? Because I think that's where all the interesting stuff happens too.
Well, it's all, you said this already, but everything is everything, right? And I think that once you can bring different things and from your spectrum, once you can bring different lessons, experiences, science, and tie it in and basically create the best performer, right? That's sort of what we're trying to tie in. And I love that concept because you do have to learn, to go into and focus on the cold. I had to learn the hard way about the cold in the sense of it's a stimulus, it's a sympathetic stimulus, if you will. And, we learn this very often, and everyone in Mindstrong has played or is playing professional sports. So when we started tinkering things on ourselves a few years ago and we started trying new things, we paid a lot of price for a lot of stupid things that we did, just in terms of specifically cold, right? And it was more challenging. The mindset, right? You get into wanting to beat somebody. We used to try to win at meditation, so when we first started doing Wim Hof, it was trying to win at breath holding, and you learn throughout the course of time. And then obviously, in the Mindstrong of working with minds and mental performance, if you're burning fuel, you're becoming reactive. And that was something where we had to learn that too. You could be burning too much fuel in a heat system or a cold system or how you're training or nasal breathing, all these sort of things. You have to be intelligent with it and have some intent. And I noticed that you do use cold with aerobic and you're training those sort of things. Can you give an idea because people who are going to listen to this train like how we're talking about? And so can you give us sort of a breakdown of what that's doing to the body and cold energy expenditure and basically how to use it to be advantageous, if you will?
Yeah, so my research in metabolism is looking at metabolic flexibility.
Yeah.
So how well does your body use carbohydrates and how well does it use fat?
Okay.
And how well do you switch back and forth between those two fuels? So if I'm going to do some very high intensity stuff, I'm going to go do sprints, I'm going to do weight training, I'm going to do maybe a 500 or a 2K on the rower, very high output, I definitely want to be able to use carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
If we're just hanging out, having this conversation, doing some very low level aerobic work, you actually want the ability on the other end to use fat. So you want the ability to use both, just depending upon the context.
Sure.
You want the ability to switch back and forth. So if I go up another level, I've been kind of interested in probably the last 5 years in what is like physiologic flexibility.
Ooh, I
right?
like that. Yeah.
And you can look up, so for example, the concept now of hormesis is very popular, right? Hormesis says that you have to kind of slightly damage a system and then it gets a little bit better over time because of that. And I think that's true. But hormesis is primarily from the study of toxicology. So if we give you this little infinitesimally small amount of a toxin, that may actually be a benefit to your system. If we give you too much, obviously you possibly die. So bad things happen. And everything can be kind of graded on that range. If you look at a term, I think that's a little bit more accurate, would be what's called adaptive homeostasis.
Okay.
Right. And there's one main researcher that's kind of his deal. And the difference between that and hormesis is adaptive homeostasis says you don't necessarily even have to be injured for your body to adapt. Right. So, for example, if we put you and did a bicep curl, at some level, you could probably get a stronger bicep without ever damaging the bicep tissue itself. Right. Because the muscle would say, there's a load here. I'm going to have to get a little bit bigger and stronger. Now, again, you could definitely damage it. You could do a lot of heavy eccentric stuff. You could have a lot of muscle damage, and you'll see a benefit once it heals.
Sure.
But damage isn't necessarily a pure requirement for the system to get better. So if that is true, then it's the stimulation, as you mentioned, that matters more than trying to really get to the point where we have an insult into the system. So if we extend that into some aerobic stuff and with cold, so one of the things I've been interested in with cold is like, what is the minimal amount that you need for your body to change?
Sure.
Right.
Great question.
So looking at physiologic flexibility, what are things that your body will do at almost all cost to hold as a homeostatic regulator? Right. So the big one is temperature. Right. Humans are homeotherms. Like we have to regulate 98.6 or within a few degrees of that, or we die.
Yeah.
However, with adaptation, right, not necessarily even having damage to the system, but just stimulating it and having it adapt, we can actually tolerate pretty high levels of temperature. We can actually tolerate pretty low levels of temperature in terms of energy dissipation through heat. Humans are probably one of the best mammals around at doing it.
Yeah.
You can extend that into possibly pH, right? Your body will do everything to regulate pH. It'll probably do everything to regulate fuel, especially blood glucose levels. So if those things are being held and being regulated, we don't want to use the change in that necessarily as our marker of progress.
Okay.
Right? We don't need to push your body temperature to 99 degrees or 100 degrees or even below 98.6.
Yeah.
However, we're looking to see how much stress can you buffer in each system over time with training, right? Just like the bench press experiment. As you train, you get better at doing the bench press over time.
Yeah.
As you have more cold exposure, as you have more heat exposure, your body adapts those systems to handle more range in temperature.
Yeah.
And I think that by targeting those underlying systems, and by measuring what is the thing that you're adapting to, right? So water, how cold was the water? How long were you in? How much were you submerged, right? Just a simple example. You're measuring what is the stimulus that you applied. And if you can handle more stimulus up to a point, a very gradual and slow progression, I think your body's ability to regulate temperature is better.
Sure.
And I believe that better regulation of those homeostatic systems, that just makes you a better, more robust, healthy human being and will probably increase your performance. Because it all ends, survival is the number one thing your body is just hard-coded to do. So if you want to be a better athlete, in my opinion, I got this from Dr. Arkab at Z Health, teach your body to survive better. And once you mastered sleep, nutrition, all the basic stuff we know, you're doing intelligent training, to me, the next level is the physiologic flexibility, right? So there, in terms of interventions, you're looking at temperature, you're looking at potentially lactate. Breathing comes in because breathing is a really easy way to potentially play with pH, right? If you're hyperventilating or hypoventilating, that's actually changing carbon dioxide levels, which is related to carbonic acid, which is related to potential changes in pH. So going all the way back to your question about aerobic training, nasal breathing, I initially started it because I'm like, if aerobic base is one of the basic parts of metabolism, if I have a bigger base and foundation, do all the other qualities I build on top get a little bit better?
Yeah.
So over the years, I've done various experiments, and every time that I get better at aerobic base, everything else goes up. So now being stuck in our houses and having my whole travel schedule just thrown out the window for
Yeah.
3 months and being at
Yeah.
home, I'm like, well, it's probably the perfect time to run that experiment,
Sure.
right? Can I do some mixed modal stuff, do some rowing, do some breathing, do it on the bike? I'm trying to stay low to moderate intensity, right?
Mhm.
Because I want to teach my body to use more fat. I want to stay in that aerobic area. And then the mental component, I think, for nasal breathing, what I've been playing around with is like if you're on a rower and you're doing like a 2K, but you're saying, okay, I'm only going to breathe through my nose.
Mhm.
At some point, it gets really, really hard,
Yeah.
right? But from a mental challenge, can I do something that's probably good for my body? Can I do something that's hard, but it's not so hard that I probably couldn't repeat it every day or every other day?
Mm.
And when heart rate's 162 and you're trying to only breathe through your nose and everything hurts,
Yeah.
you're still sub max, right?
Mhm.
You're still below your max. But man, it is so hard to just stay focused in that moment, right?
Yeah.
If we drop you in a tub of 45-degree water and just not to lose your shit, that's hard,
Yeah.
right?
100%.
Especially if you don't have practice,
Right.
right? But to me, the definition of mental toughness is can you do something that feels very hard, but can you still stay in control and can you still stay checked into the process?
Yeah, I
Can you
love
not
that, man.
completely disassociate? Can you not completely check out and go somewhere else? Can you? I remember Dr. Eric Hobbs said this once to me about combatives. I said, "What do you do when you're like being kicked in the shin all the time? Like that hurts.
Yeah.
We know that pain can downregulate your system." He's like, "You acknowledge the pain and then you just forget about it,
Mm.
right?" So you're not saying that this doesn't hurt or this isn't bad or I got dropped into water, that this doesn't suck,
Sure.
but can I control my response to it now?
Yeah.
Can I control the response to the hard thing that I'm doing?
Mhm.
And to me, that's a very trainable skill.
Yes,
And
100%.
that, to me, is a definition of mental toughness. Right? Mental toughness to me isn't just doing insane weight training stuff and then you go puke somewhere and lose yourself.
Right.
It's like, can you maintain control doing something that feels just really, really hard?
That's one of the coolest definition or answers, if you will, in that space that I've heard, Doc. So that's
Oh,
amazing,
thank
man.
you.
It's something where it forces you to make conscious decisions under pressure when you add some
Yes.
sort of stimulus with the cold and the heat. And again, we're talking pure training here, right? And that was something I also had to flip my mindset because when I used to play, when I was in college, and this would have been over 10 years ago, we only used ice as a recovery tool. Where
Yep.
now I would almost not use it as a recovery tool, depending on. I guess that's just personal preference, but I don't
Sure.
look at cold outside. I look at it as very meditative or stressful. And so I use
Hmm.
it to sort of feel my physiology, and I'll just get it into the cold. And if I use a cold shower, it's more sparking energy. If I use it at night,
Yes.
it's more just really quick, just to get an arousal state and then downshift, and then spend an hour or two before bed, naturally calming down. But then if I use like our lake or a tub, I use it how you just said it. But I guess I haven't really thought about myself using it as a recovery technique since I played ball. But do you still
Hmm.
look at that as recovery? Where I would still use a sauna as recovery,
Sure.
but I don't use ice. Can you kind of go into the depths of how you view that?
Yeah, so if we look at from a pure physiology side and we just throw the mental and the psychology
Yeah.
out of it for a moment,
Hmm.
for cold, most of the stuff you're going to look at is research on what's called cold water immersion.
Yeah.
You have two methods. You've got either water or air, right? So the cryo things that you see. For recovery, the air, I'm not convinced that it's all that helpful. The data is kind of split.
Sure.
And I think one of the reasons there is I'm guessing that you may see more of a nervous system regulation with air because you're hitting the skin temperature.
Hmm.
And we know the skin has a lot of those sympathetic nerve endings in it.
Hmm.
So I think, and then this is just a hypothesis, that the cold air is more of I feel really, really good. I feel more energized, almost like a cold shower
Yeah.
because you're getting blasted with cold water, but it's running off right away.
Okay.
Where I think of cold water immersion, which we do have some pretty good studies on, can help recovery, but the caveat is for how long and what are you doing and what are you trying to recover from?
Hmm.
right? So there was a study they did with mixed martial artists. They put them in a cold water tub. I think they typically use like 50 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 to 10 minutes, somewhere around there.
Okay.
And what they saw is that the next day, in terms of strength and nervous system recovery, they were definitely better. There's been a couple other studies that have looked at that with athletes.
Okay.
You go to like most professional sports areas, they've got, cold tub. You talk to guys like Joe DeFranco, like pretty much every coach who's used it with athletes, I haven't really heard anyone say that it was not beneficial.
Nice.
Now, again, that's anecdotal. That could be, psychosomatic. That could be a whole bunch of different things.
Sure.
But without fail, like almost all of it is positive. And the handful of studies we have for performance agrees with that.
Mm-hmm.
The caveat is if we look at pure hypertrophy, which to me is more like a side effect of training,
Mm-hmm.
then there's one study from Norway that shows it was actually detrimental for hypertrophy gains. So again, they took two groups of athletes. I think it was an 8-week study.
Okay.
And they put them in a cold water immersion, so up to their neck, for 50 degrees for 10 minutes. The other group, after training, they just sat there outside at normal temperatures. So a very well done study.
Mm-hmm.
The catch is that it was looking only at hypertrophy changes, right? So adding muscle mass, and was done immediately after the sensation of training.
Mm.
The theory is that it blunts some of the signaling mechanisms that go off from training.
Sure.
So again, there's a couple of studies showing that for pure hypertrophy reasons, if you want to all-out max hypertrophy, doing it immediately after may not be the best idea. Now, we don't know if you're only in for a couple minutes, does that have the same effect? If you do it at a different time of the day,
Yeah.
all that stuff we have absolutely
Well,
no idea
and
at
temperature
this point.
too, right? What if you were
And
just
temperature.
Yeah. 'Cause
Yeah.
you could
So
have
if
it
you go
super cold.
colder,
Yeah.
but you go shorter, my guess is that it probably won't affect it. So heat for the most part is beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone comes to me and it's just like, they grab you in the elevator and they go, hey, I want to use like cold or heat for recovery.
Yeah.
And I want to, maximize my muscle mass and strength. I'm probably going to tell them just chill out and do some relaxing breath work in the sauna when you're done lifting. Because we know, if anything, that may help recovery a little bit. We know that heat will not have an interference effect with training, especially from an hypertrophy standpoint.
Yeah.
We know from some sauna studies looking at reduction in atrophy, so reduced how much muscle mass you lose. So they've casted some limbs and looked at stuff like that. Sauna does actually help reduce how much muscle mass is lost. It's just various different mechanisms and heat shock proteins and a bunch of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So sauna in general is more, I hate to use the word anabolic, but potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Cold could go either way depending upon what you're looking at.
Sure.
So if I have an athlete and they don't know anything, I'd be like, hey, just go in the sauna for 5, 10, 15 minutes after you're done training. My bias is do some relaxing breath work. I'm trying to get you back down into a more parasympathetic state. And I know in the back of my head, there's not really any potential interference effects with it. If they want to use cold, now we got a little bit more nuanced conversation about, okay, what is your ultimate goal? What are you trying to do? Is it strength? Is it skill? Is it muscle mass? And it's just a conversation that's, should be had, but it's when you've got a limited interaction, it's much harder.
No, that's an awesome answer as well, man. And I think, I don't play sports anymore, so sometimes I won't be as in tune with trying to chase a particular edge. Now, obviously, the athletes that I train, we would have that sort of discussion. But perfect example, our group of friends, we have our own sauna, and it's pretty big. I mean, you can fit 16 people in it if you wanted to. And
nice.
Yeah, and it's mobile, and it's really cool. And so what we would do before all this stuff really happened was we would have just friend gatherings. We'd all have a dinner before or after, and we would do heat and ice for an hour and a half and have a beer or so afterwards, and it was really relaxing. Now, we did that for a few, we've been doing that for years, but for a few years there, I noticed that the next day I was tapped. Like I couldn't lift the next day in the morning, or if I did it too late at night, again, I was tapped. And so then we started athletes started joining us, and we were checking out their monitors. And at first, they were just doing what we did. We just joined the group and we all hung out. And over the years, we've now seen trends, and that is a full-blown workout, heat and ice. And that's where I've actually induced it into training, and now I love it. One, it's fun. Two, you can be outside, so that's always cool. And then it's unique. But, I mean, we've seen people burn upwards of 700 calories of an hour. If you're doing an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes of just rotating heat, ice, and doing any sort of minimal mobility movement. And so that was a really big eye opener to me, where I was like, this is a stressor. This is training. This isn't necessarily recovery. And I actually, Fergus Conley is a guy I look up to a lot in the field, and he talks to me a lot about what is training and recovering, because what they could be doing the same, and so to take that a little bit deeper, have you noticed that obviously you've probably noticed the same things, but what is just doing heat and ice as a contrast? So using extreme heat and extreme ice, because that is, the nervous system is going to be tapped after that. And I've been very experimental on that, and I'm trying to keep diving deeper into it. But do you experiment with that, or can you kind of take that deeper into what that's doing to the body, and people listening, looking at that not as necessarily a recovery tool, but as an understanding of your training?
Yeah, so my bias with it, and I don't have a sauna here yet.
Okay.
I think I've almost figured out a way to get one. We live in a townhouse, and so I wanted like a barrel sauna, but hopefully no one on the association is listening. But I wasn't going to spend a lot of thousands of dollars to put something on property that they may later say I have to get rid of. But now there's some portable ones. There's some other stuff you can do. So I think I figured out a workaround with it. To me, so I would say taking the average person who's an athlete and dropping him into a session you just described is probably going to be a high level of what's called distress, right? So we can think of stress as eustress or distress. So eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, is a stress that you can more quickly adapt to. So if I did like an easy aerobic session like I did this morning, that doesn't take me that long to adapt to. I could go in and do that, again, the next day. Performance is probably going to be around the same. So within 24 hours, I'm good to go again. Probably even less than that if I really pushed it. Most athletes who do a competition, right? So if you do the CrossFit Games, you're doing an obstacle course race, powerlifting meet, Olympic lifting meet, whatever, that's probably a distress session, even for very advanced athletes, because they're right at their max and testing their max. It's going to take them several days to recover and to get back to where they were before. Most of the time, ideally, that was their peak, so it may even be weeks after that. But that's fine, because that was their goal, and they got time to do it. Taking heat and cold back-to-back with someone who is not used to either one is probably going to be a very distressed thing for their system.
Sure.
So my bias with athletes and people I work with is I will pick one adaptation to work on first and then push that out as far as I can. And then I'll take the next one and push that out as far as I can. And then I'll transition. Right. So depending on what they have access to. So for now, I have access to more of a cold tub freezer. So that's what I'm doing with myself is I'm slowly kind of acclimating to cold.
Okay.
And then once I have access to heat, I'll be doing a little bit more heat, and I maybe only do cold once or twice a week. Just like if I want to get bigger bench press, right?
Yeah.
I'm probably going to do a fair amount of bench press. I'm probably going to limit some of the other stuff that I can do so I can put more time and effort into the bench press, right? Just as an example.
Sure.
So I think building up that adaptation first, right? So metabolically, if someone is really bad at using fat, I'm going to design a program that's going to enhance their body's ability to use fat for maybe 8 weeks.
Wow.
And then we're going to look at how to use carbohydrates, and then we're going to look at transitions. So I think by building the adaptation, giving just that one stimulus and letting the body get better at that, then going to the other stimulus and just keeping that on maintenance.
Sure.
You look at like Russian block periodization, stuff like that. And then the ultimate is exactly what you described, hard transitions from one to the other, right? Because if you've ever, I was in Finland, we did the classical Finnish sauna where everyone's like buck naked, and then we ran and jumped in the lake. And it was awesome. It was amazing. but that is one hell of a shock if you've never done it before,
It's wild.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fun. It was great. I'm so glad I did it,
Yeah.
but it's a pretty big shock,
Yeah.
right? So I think building up those adaptations and then doing a transition, I think is useful. Now, I think in an advanced athlete who's gone through that progression and has gotten there, I think that could very well be very recovery orientated for them.
Mm-hmm.
The caveat is for them at that state.
Mm-hmm.
To drop most people into that situation is probably going to be very stressful. If you look at HRV, you look at markers for a few days after, it's probably going to be kind of askew.
Sure.
So, like if you're Zach Bittner, like, doing a 100-mile run, that's like a big race at the world record for it. For him to do a 15-mile training run, that's like kind of a joke. That's like recovery day.
Right.
For me, that would probably kill me.
Me too,
right?
man.
So it's the context we always have to keep in mind about it.
No, I love it. Well, so you touched on, and just to tie a bow, sort of, we'll finish here on the HRV because you just touched on it.
Yeah.
But a lot of guys, I've used them, I've tinkered with them. I've tried to get out of technology just for my personal training, and that's just my own opinion. I just really like trying to be intuitive and feel how I feel. But HRV is definitely something that's heavily used in sports and athletics and those sort of things. And I go on the basis of it. Basically, if it's good, psychologically, physiologically, you're on tune. If it's not, you can kind of base some stuff. And I was actually looking into like the NBA, I think does some things where they'll actually play guys more or less depending on HRV. I could be off on that. I know some organizations are starting to do that, but can you sort of give a breakdown of HRV and how you look at that and how you would you use that in the moment, or do you just use that as a biofeedback to kind of how you're progressing somebody?
Yeah, so most of my clients are online, and most of the consulting I do is online. I mean, obviously, not the conditions we're in now. I do in-person stuff here too, but it's more limited when I'm home and that sort of thing. So for me, I don't have the luxury, especially with training plans, of being in a facility and watching someone walk in. Right? I can't watch their gait. I can't watch their head position. I can't watch their breathing patterns. All the other things that advanced coaches will almost unconsciously use all the time to kind of gauge where the readiness of that person is. So online, I find it's super useful because heart rate variability will give us a status of what is called the autonomic nervous system, right? So for people listening, the autonomic nervous system has two branches. One is the parasympathetic, which is like pushing hard down on the brake of your car. If I push hard down on the brake, the car is going to slow down. So more what's called parasympathetic tone or vagal tone actually causes your heart rate to go down lower. So more rest and recovery area. Sympathetic is more like the gas pedal on the car. I push down on it harder, your heart rate's going to accelerate, the car is going to go faster. It's more stressful, but you get more performance out of the vehicle. Neither one is good or bad. It's just you want to have a balanced state between both of them. And heart rate variability, I usually just do it one time first thing in the morning. I use the iFleet system mostly. Sometimes I'll use an Oura Ring. That will tell me the status of that autonomic nervous system. Are you more on the parasympathetic kind of side, rest and recovery, so to speak, or are you on more the sympathetic side? Acute prediction, however, of performance, endurance training, it's okay. Anaerobic type sports, prediction of performance acutely, so on that day, it's really not that great. But I use it like the RPMs or the check engine light on the car, right? If I redline my little Jetta, I could probably make it to Cub Foods faster. But I can't expect to redline the car every day and expect the car to do like 300,000 miles. Right?
Work, right?
It's like, I can push it and I can get more performance, but what is the cost of doing that? Right. So I'm a little bigger fan of auto-regulating people's training, not necessarily for acute performance on that day, but day in and day out, can I get a really good high-quality training session in? Now, some days, like I had a guy who was set to do a 2,000-meter row on the rower. It was his test day. His HRV was dog crap. But I'm like, his average was okay. The rest of his life was in check. We had, given him a lot more carbohydrates. I'm like, you'll probably be fine just for that one session. So just go do it.
Yeah,
And you
let
got
it
like a
rip.
PR by like 4 seconds,
Yeah,
right?
let it rip. Yeah.
Because I have the luxury now of changing his training the next 2 days after. So the next day he just went for a long walk. The day after he just did some easy dude bro hypertrophy stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So I
Yeah.
knew the
Yeah.
cost was probably going to be higher than usual, but that was fine, right? This is kind of one of his goals. He's an obstacle course racer. So it is tied to his top level goal. But without heart rate variability,
You
it would be
wouldn't.
much harder for me to
Right.
figure that out, right? I
Right.
might have just assumed that he was okay, good to go. I feel a little bit tired. Yeah, it's hard to interpret that.
Yeah.
So again, it's just for me, it's another cross check of what is the stress level of the organism at that point in time.
Hmm.
Now I can use that however I want, right? Because there's no little guy that pops up out of the HRV that says, okay, here's your handcuffs. You can't go to the gym and train today,
Yeah.
right? It's just saying,
Yeah.
hey, bro, you can go train if you want. Just be aware that it may come at a little bit higher cost.
Yeah.
But even that's not always 100% true. Because if I have a red or a low HRV, I can go to the gym and do some light dude bro hypertrophy work. And as long as I don't push it to failure, I'm normally better the next day.
Mm.
The only reason I know that is because I've done that enough to see that that's a normal response.
Hmm.
Now, if I went and did a 2,000-meter test on the rower, I'd be trashed for probably like 3 to 4 days if I did an all-out like RP of a 10 type
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So again, it's all individual, but it gives you another piece of data to try to interpret. Okay, with this person, especially in a remote situation, what do I want to do, and do I want to change some of the stressors that they're going to experience?
That's a great breakdown, man. Hey, it was a blast to talk to you and pick your brain here for an hour or so. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate you jumping on with us. But for people listening to us, how can they get more in depth with what you're doing, Mike, and give us a little bit of how people can find you?
Yeah, so best place is probably just the website, which is just miketnelson.com, miketnelson.com. There'll be usually an opt-in at the top of the page there. I think right now it's some offer on protein where you can get some cool downloads and get on the newsletter. So most of the stuff I write now, probably 90% of it goes out to the newsletter, which is
Right
just
on.
free to join.
Hmm.
I do also have a certification, which is the Flex Diet certification, looking at metabolic flexibility. And that's just at flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. And at some point, I'm probably doing a certification on the physiologic flexibility stuff we talked about too. So
That's
not sure
awesome.
when that'll be out, but
Yeah.
that'll go out to the newsletter stuff first.
Well, you're the man. I really appreciate it, Mike. And for myself, I appreciate you giving away the time, and I always like to thank people for that. It's a great form of leadership, my man. So thank you for answering those questions and clearing up some things. And a lot of people who listen to our show are going to be in tune with that specific conversation. So it'll be really cool for people to tie into that. I'm really excited to pass the torch of your work, and I'm excited to see the next CD you play when you go lift. So keep it rolling,
Yeah.
man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And yeah, we'll have to get together sometime, do some sauna and some ice stuff. And I think today's selection is either Parkway Drive or Heaven Shall Burn. I have my new shirt on. So
You're the man. Yeah, we'll show you the mobile sauna when things clear up, and we'll get
for
together
sure.
and pull it out. So, all right, man. Hey, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will talk to you soon. Okay.
Awesome.
All right. See
Thank
you,
you so
Mike.
much.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.